So thanks everyone. Apologize for the short technical issues here, but let's go ahead and get started. So, I know that there's a kind of a vast audience today, a number of different people that are viewing the presentation, and some of you are probably familiar with Core Associates and of the product that we originally developed for Core, which is called TimberScan. Today what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at TimberScan Titanium for Sage Intacct. So we're going to start with a kind of a brief PowerPoint presentation before we actually get into the application. The idea behind the Titanium suite is to design a complete purchase-to-pay solution where we never touch the paper. That's Core's goal, that's TimberScan's goal. We want to provide the experience where we can take an invoice or any other document from its initial inception through any type of a routing and approval process and hopefully never touch the paper along the way. So within TimberScan Titanium, we can acquire invoices. There are a number of different tools that we can use to acquire the invoice. We'll talk about that. And we can also OCR the invoices. So rather than having to key in all of the information associated with the invoice, we can eliminate a lot of the coding by retrieving information directly from the image or other tools as well. As far as routing and approval, we have a number of different ways in which an invoice can be routed to an approver or approvers, and then the concept is to be able to use TimberScan Titanium on your phone, on an iPad, regardless of what type of device you're working with, to be able to actually go through the process of approving the invoice. So the idea is one system, one platform, one data entry point seamlessly integrated with Sage Intacct. And again, where we're starting here is at the automated workflow automation of AP invoices and associated documents using rules-based routing. This product was designed exclusively for Sage Intacct, so the AP entry screen will replicate the experience that would take place within Sage Intacct. The distribution grid works the exact same way. And we've also created the opportunity for documents, invoices, supporting documents, all the way to the check to be attached in the within Sage Intacct. And I'll show you an example of how we can go through the process of retrieving and seeing those documents. So finally, what we want to do is just talk about the workflow. And then what I'm going to do is go into the application, and I'm going to walk through these various steps within TimberScan Titanium. So everything will start at the point where an invoice arrives at your door, and regardless of how you receive the invoice initially, to get it into TimberScan, we'll use a number of different tools, which we'll talk about. But once it has been acquired, it will then be assigned to data entry. So a lot of times when we're talking with someone who is new to the workflow experience associated with TimberScan or TimberScan Titanium, the thought is, well, how do we get the invoices off to the approvers? That's going to happen once we go through the initial data entry. What's nice about the data entry in Titanium, as I mentioned earlier, is that it replicates the experience of entering an invoice in Sage Intacct, but with a number of other tools and other features, including the OCR technology and the ability to partially code an invoice. So I might know the project, but I might not know the task, for example. And I can take the invoice at whatever level I need to, and I can route the invoice off to the approvers. There are a number of different ways in which the workflow can be set up in order to establish that routing process. It can go off to multiple approvers. You can set up things like thresholds, for example. Ultimately, once the invoices get approved, they will then update Sage Intacct. And within Sage Intacct, as I mentioned, you'll be able to see the invoice, any of the supporting documents, and all the way down to the check, because we're able to also attach the check to the invoice if need be. So with this as kind of our backdrop, what I'm going to do is exit out of the PowerPoint. We'll go into the application, and we're just going to walk through these various steps. Now, I'd also mentioned that I'm talking about AP invoices because typically with many of our clients, that's the area where the client wants to start. They want to be able to start at that point where they can get the AP routing and approval process under control. But this same workflow scenario can be designed for any type of document that you want. So, for example, if you wanted to store and manage, purchase orders, receiving tickets, whatever it might be, you can store them in the application. You can use them as supporting documents, and I'll show you an example of that. Or you can also just use them for other purposes, like, for example, if I needed to take a contract and route that contract to various people and let them review and approve it, I can use that workflow just as if I were doing something with an AP invoice. Okay, so with that, let's go ahead and get out of the PowerPoint, and let's go into TimberScan Titanium. So I've already logged into the application. I've already logged into Intacct as well. We're going to start here in Titanium, and we're going to kind of work our way through the process from here. So from a navigation perspective, the way that Titanium is designed is it is a browser-based system, as you can see. So I've logged in through my web browser, and I'm able to select from the side panel whatever application I choose. So if I wanted to go into data entry, for example, I choose data entry, and then it brings up the various functions that are associated with that application. Same thing applies to everything associated with the side panel here. If I just want to go back to home, just click on the wheel, and it takes me back to where we started at the beginning. It also clears up the main body of the window so that when I'm starting to open up parts of the application, those items will then populate into the main body. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll start at the point where an invoice arrives at your door, and regardless of how you would receive that invoice initially, to get it into Titanium, what you would do is choose the acquire function. And then we'll go out and we'll start to acquire some documents. Now, there are a couple of fields that have to be selected first in order for us to be able to acquire any type of a document. The first is what's called the data entry group. So if you think back to the PowerPoint slide, what we're going to do is we're going to take an invoice, or let's just take invoice as our example, and we're going to assign it to data entry. And then someone in data entry is going to start entering that invoice before it gets routed off to an approver. Now, the data entry group could be quite diverse. It could be more than one person. It could be a group of people. So as you start to establish individual licensed users, you will set them up in a way where they could either be accessing the data entry individually, or they could be set up as part of a group. So I'm just going to go in here. I'm going to select my data entry group. And then the second thing I need to do is determine what type of document I'm acquiring. So in this case, we'll say invoices. And then we'll look at some examples of how we go about doing this. So one thing I could do is, let me clear some of these screens behind me here, is I can just drag and drop a document. So if I were, sitting here at my desktop and, maybe I had something that was emailed to me, or, it was sitting in a file, I can just go ahead and drag, and I'm going to drag and drop this 2-page document that you see here, and then we'll just go ahead and open it up. So in this case, what I've done is I've acquired an invoice, and at the top here, I have all of my controls and annotation tools. So if I want to just make the document larger or smaller, I can do so. If I want to open up the thumbnail, I can then toggle so that I can see both pages in the thumbnail, or I can just scroll up and down if I need to. Now, in this case, this is a situation where SCS sent me 2 invoices in one PDF. So they sent me invoice 393, and if I go to the second page, they sent invoice 394. Now, typically, when we're going to go through the process of acquiring invoices, the system is going to recognize each PDF as a separate invoice, and it will split it for me automatically. But in this case, because I have 2 invoices in one PDF, I have to split it myself. So it's very simple. You just right-click. You can say, I want to split here, and now I've just separated those 2 documents. Simple, easy, easily able for me to be able to go through and split these two documents, and now I'm on my way. And I hit the acquire button, and it will then assign those invoices to the data entry queue that I assigned when I selected the data entry group originally. So drag and drop is one option. Second option would be invoices that arrive in the mail. In that case, what would happen is those invoices would be scanned. So you'd put them onto a scanning device and scan them to whatever file we want to link to TimberScan Titanium. So again, I'm going to start here by choosing my data entry group, and I'll choose invoices again. And then what I'm going to do is I've scanned those invoices to my file, and I'll just go out, I'll open the file, and here they are. So if I were to go in here and select this whole stack, I can grab them all at one time, open them up, and then when I continue, it starts opening them up into the viewer. And again, I can do the same thing. So I'm able to view them. If I needed to make any notes, annotations, or what have you on any of the documents beforehand, if I needed to eliminate a document because maybe it's something that I acquired and I decided I don't want to acquire it now for some reason, I can just go ahead and eliminate that document. So a number of different things that I can do here. So scanning is option number 2. Third option, email. So TimberScan Titanium has an email monitoring tool associated with it. And what happens is that it's monitoring a designated AP email address, or any email address for that matter. So then what happens is that, in many cases, many clients today have a specific AP email address where they've asked vendors and subs to email invoices to. So what would happen is that Titanium will monitor that email address, and then it just takes the invoice image from the email and it drops it into a selected file. So we're going to start here again, go in, we'll select our data entry group, we'll select the invoice, and again, now what I would be doing is I'd be perusing out to, for example, my email file, and again, same concept. We just go ahead and grab a whole stack of invoices, and we just open them up and acquire them all at the same time. So what's the advantage of doing this? Well, what this does is this allows for me to not have to constantly go through the process of monitoring myself an email address and then take each individual attachment that comes into that email and drag and drop it to this screen. In this case, what I can do is just let the system go through, monitor the email itself, and then it just drops it into a file, and I just pull it from a file. So once we've done this and we've gone through and we've acquired the invoices, they're then going to reside in the AP invoice entry queue, which is where I'm going to go here in a couple moments. But I wanted to talk about another tool that is also available within Titanium. So we just talked about email monitoring. What we also have available is something called auto acquire. What this does, and let me go in and show this first, and then I'll explain basically how it kind of pulls everything together. So in auto acquire, if I go in here and choose this one, I've already set one up. Basically what I can do is I could say, okay, let me go out and acquire invoices from certain email addresses, or I can just say use a wildcard like I've done here, and that basically is saying that regardless of what email comes into ap@core-asssoc.com, I'm going to retrieve that particular invoice or that document from that email. So again, I could be specific about certain email addresses that I want to be able to retrieve the invoice from, or I can just use a wildcard and let any invoice or any email that comes in to this particular address just drop those particular invoices into this particular area. Now, what I'm also doing here is I'm auto-assigning this to the data entry group to where it needs to go. And if we have a scenario like we had with SCS, where they sent me 2 invoices in one PDF, what I can do is I can use some sort of an indicator that allows me to separate the invoices. So this way, I wouldn't get a situation where I would acquire 2 invoices from a vendor and it didn't split them. So I could do something like this. I could say, using text, invoice one of, for example. And whenever it sees that particular text on the invoice, it knows that there have to be more than one invoice, so it's just going to go ahead and split it at that point. Finally, what I can also do is I can take the invoices and I can process them through the OCR tool, which we're going to talk about in a few moments. So basically, to kind of summarize what I'm able to do with auto acquire is everything that I showed back here in the acquire screen, where I had to go in and select the data entry group, I had to select the document type, I had to split the invoices if I needed to, and I had to acquire them, either from a file or what have you. Basically, the auto acquire function does all of that for you automatically. So any invoice that comes in, it will automatically acquire it. No one has to go through this process, and the invoices will be automatically residing in AP invoice entry. So we've eliminated basically all of the steps that I just talked about here by using auto acquire. All right, so we've gone through the acquire process. Now let's go into AP invoice entry, and we'll talk about some of the tools that are available to me here. So I have some invoices that have been acquired already. There are different ways that I can go about selecting which invoices I wanted to process. As you can see, it's laid out in a nice card format here where I can just go through and selectively choose which invoices I wanted to look at. I can actually view some of the information associated with the invoice right on the front screen if I need to. I could say select all. If I do that, then what it will do is it will queue them up in a format where it will then start opening up the first invoice and then all of the other succeeding invoices behind it. Or I can just selectively go in here and say, okay, just open up this first invoice for me. So several things that we want to talk about with the AP invoice entry. As I mentioned before, first of all of these fields that you see in the data entry queue here in the grid are laid out in the exact same order that they are in Intacct. So if someone were entering an invoice here, they're processing an invoice in essence the same way that they would in Intacct, only it's designed a little bit differently in this somewhat of what we call the grid format, so that we just make it easier for people to be able to process. But everything is laid out in the same order, and it functions the same way, and we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail here in a second. Now, what you'll notice is here is that I have the invoice image at the top of the screen, and I have the data entry grid down at the bottom. Now, I can make this a little bit smaller if I want, just to shrink it up so I can see more of the image. But there are several things that I can do to kind of move this around if I need to. So one thing I could do is I could just go in here and I could say change mode. If I do that, what it will do is it will move this data entry grid over to the side. And if I eliminate the thumbnail view, in essence, what I could do is if I want to shift this over a little bit, I could potentially have the invoice image on one side, and I could have the data entry grid on the other. Another option is I can disconnect the invoice, and I could move it to a second screen. So in many cases where I might have dual, if you have dual screens, for example, you just click on this little up arrow. It lets me take that invoice image, move it off to a second screen. So now I can have the invoice image in full view on one side, and here in the data entry screen, I can have the whole data entry screen here to myself. Okay, so a couple of other things. We'll talk about some of the control buttons down here at the bottom. But what you see here is I've gone through and I've actually entered a lot of the information on this particular invoice already. But basically the way it works is you're just going through, you're selecting, for example, what the location is. And you see as I'm clicking on the little eyeglass here, what it's doing is it's going through and it's doing a search for me. It's allowing me to search, for example, if I need to search the vendor file, I'm searching the vendors. And all of these searches, all of the master files that we're searching for are coming directly from Intacct. So again, it's the experience of basically processing an invoice as if I were keying this into Intacct directly. Now I've gone to the point of entering some of the basic information on the invoice. You can see that there are some items here that have to be filled in before we can go on. So I have to put in the date, I have to put in the vendor and the due date, and then down here at the bottom, we start processing from there. So in this case, what I did was I entered the invoice up to the point where I plugged in the, let me slide over here just a little bit. I plugged in the project, but I left, for example, the task and the cost type blank. So as I was saying before, one of the nice features of the way that Titanium works is that if I wanted to from right here, I could just go ahead and save and route this particular invoice. And it will send it off to the approvers. It invokes the business rules based on what has been keyed in on the invoice so far, and it sends it off to the approvers. The idea behind this is that there may be circumstances in many cases where, from an accounts payable perspective, I don't know exactly what task, what cost type might be associated with this invoice. I need the project manager, for example, to go in and code that for me. So we allow for the project manager to code by simply leaving it blank, saving and routing, and then when it gets off into, that approver's queue, I'm saying project manager, but it could be anyone that needs to approve an invoice, they're then going to pick up that invoice and they'll finish the coding on their end. And you can set up the criteria in the system so that you give access to people to either be able to code and approve, or perhaps they can just approve or reject. So, if you had certain people that you said, we want them to be able to do the coding, we have other people, we want them to be able to view the invoice, but not actually do the coding, you can restrict access from that level. All right, so a few other things here. First of all, what you'll notice when you see the invoice image up here at the top, you notice that some of these fields are, they're highlighted. The reason they are is because we've deployed a tool that we built called Smart Extraction. And what that does is, even if I don't have what we call a capture OCR template set up for this particular vendor, the system can still recognize certain key fields that it will retrieve when you bring this invoice into the invoice entry queue. And I'll show you an example of one where I don't have a template set up, and you can see what it does with Smart Extraction. Now, down here at the bottom, some of the other control buttons here, I could put this invoice on hold in AP invoice entry. Basically, what I'm saying is I've started processing, but I need to move on to, maybe I'm waiting for something else to happen. Maybe I'm waiting for, a supporting document to come in before I can attach it and send it on. But I want to put it on hold and kind of get it out of my entry queue so that I'll know that I can just queue up my on-hold invoices if I need to. We've talked about the grid view. You can switch from grid to what is called form view. What this is ideal for is if I were in the approval side, which I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail when we get over to the approval side. But if you're an approver and you're working on, for example, on a phone, it's not always easy to be able to code on this grid format. So it's much easier to be able to do this using the form view, where I can have the image on one side and have all of my coding detail on the other. So let's switch back to grid view here. The info button allows me to be able to see certain key information that might be associated with this transaction. And then we'll talk about the OCR in a couple of moments. We talked about change mode. You can add notes. You can view what notes have been associated with the invoice. So if I don't want to clutter up this invoice with a bunch of sticky notes and annotations, I can just click on the Add Note button. I can go ahead and put in my note, and then once this invoice gets routed to the approver, anytime the approver opens up the invoice, the note will pop up in front of them. So they're going to see that. It's going to stand out before they start processing. And then we've talked about supporting documents. So, in this case, maybe what I want to do is I want to go out and see if there are any supporting documents that might be associated with this invoice. So anything that I may have acquired or someone may have acquired that maybe we've indexed, for example, to this vendor in this project. So I click on the supporting documents tab. I do have a purchase order, for example. I can go out and I can view that PO if I want to be able to just see the image itself. And then if I want to go ahead and attach it, I can just go ahead and select that particular document, and I can save that document and attach it to that particular invoice. And then ultimately, as I mentioned, you can save and route, and from there, the invoice gets routed off to the approver. All right, so let's back up, and let's go back out here to the Acquire screen. I just want to double check and make sure that I don't have a template set up for a particular vendor. Okay, so I'm going to go back out here. We're going to acquire an invoice. Oops. We'll say data entry, say it's an invoice. And I'm going to go out and I'm going to use Ellis because I don't have an OCR template set up for Ellis. Let's go ahead and acquire that. Okay. So once I acquire it, it's going to drop into the AP invoice entry queue here in just a couple seconds. It'll update here. All right, so it should be probably this very last invoice that I just acquired. So again, if I go into Ellis Lumber, basically what you see here is that certain information has already been extracted using that smart extraction technology. So it's actually going in and it's looking for certain key information and it's populating certain fields for me. Now, I'm going to go out here and I'm going to set up a template. I'm going to add a new template, and we're going to say that it's Ellis. And I'm just going to go out and I'm going to grab my invoice here. And I'll show you how quick and easy you can go out and you can set up an OCR template for a particular vendor. So I've grabbed their invoice. I'm just going to go ahead and save it. So the smart extraction technology took over here. And again, it started finding certain key information. And it started to extract that information for me. So I can see that certain things have already been highlighted here that it's going to retrieve for me. The invoice number, the billing date, the due date, the amount. Now, there's also the concept of what's called an anchor. The anchor is what the system uses to be able to recognize this invoice as a unique invoice for Ellis Lumber. So basically what I could do is it said, okay, I was going to use this date. Well, if I don't want to use the date, I can just move this around. So I could say, okay, just move it up here. And let's use Ellis Lumber as my anchor instead. So we'll just do that, spread it out here. So now from this point forward, anytime it retrieves an invoice, it's going to be looking for this particular name, for example, instead of the address as the anchor. All right, so let's continue along here. So now what I'm going to do is, in addition to the information that it retrieves from the invoice itself, I'm going to actually start to build some what we call coding fields so that it will retrieve that information as well. So if I go in and edit here, I'm going to add a field. And the first thing I want to do is I want to go get the vendor number. Because if you think about it, on the actual invoice itself, Ellis Lumber didn't put their vendor code. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in, I'm going to plug in the vendor, and we'll say it's a fixed field. And then I'm just going to go out and search. We'll look for Ellis, and we'll plug that in. And I'm going to save that so that then what's going to happen is that I've now, in addition to the information that it's going to retrieve from the actual invoice itself, it's also going to populate the vendor code. Now, a couple of other things that I could also do here. I could do things like, set up something where if I wanted to retrieve, for example, the job number. If there's something that is on the invoice that indicates that it's a job. Or maybe, for example, there's no invoice number, and I need to use some sort of a scenario where I build the invoice number myself. So those are the types of things that you can go through and you can create here with the actual coding profile. When I'm finished, I just go ahead and finish up here, and that particular vendor's invoice is done. And when we go back in here, it will then recognize the information associated with that invoice, including picking up the vendor code for me. So it's very quick, Very easy. In fact, we're adding some enhancements to this to make it even easier, where you can actually just build the template right on the fly from the entry screen if need be. But it's basically going through populating the information, and then I'm finished from here, and I can just go ahead and save and route the invoice. So again, if you don't have a template, the smart extraction will start to populate some of the basic fields. The template then allows you to build other fields that you want to be able to extract or build into that particular invoice as you're acquiring invoices for that vendor. Vendor number, maybe an expression. You know, that's an example where I want to be able to build my own invoice number because Ellis didn't put their invoice number on. So those types of things are all possible with the OCR. So quick, simple. It allows me to populate the invoice entry screen so I'm not having to come in here and build this information myself. And from here, I can just go ahead and save and route the invoice, and off it goes. So we're eliminating as much of the data entry as possible, allowing for the invoice to, and if we actually kind of go back here for just a second and look at this starting from the point where we went through auto acquire, we were able to eliminate someone from having to go into acquire and assign the invoice to someone in data entry. And then when it gets to that person in data entry, these fields can be pre-populated with the OCR so that they can go through. If they have to finish any coding, they can go ahead and do so, and then save and route the invoice, and off it goes to the approvers. All right, so let's switch hats for a couple of moments, and I'm going to become an approver. So, you know, we've built reports into the system. So if I wanted to go out and I wanted to see, for example, you know, by user, by job, what the status is for, you know, invoices. So there's always ways in which I can go about tracking and seeing where invoices are at any given time. In document automation, there's something called a workflow execution status, which can be set up as more of kind of like almost like a spreadsheet where you can go through and you can view anything that might be outstanding or in a workflow task queue to be able to see where it stands at any given time. So we built certain tools, and you can also use the search criteria to be able to go search for information. But we've built a number of tools that allow you to be able to go search and find where invoices are and attain the status to know exactly where things stand. Now here, if I go into my workflow task queue, I have 6 invoices that are waiting for me to approve. So a couple comments on this here. You notice how there are some highlighted fields here, or objects, that I can choose right off the screen from here. So again, we're looking at this. I'm now an approver. I've gone in and I'm looking at this more in this card view format again. And there's the option for right here. If I wanted to, I could just reject the invoice. So I'm looking at this. I can see some of the summary information here. Okay, I have enough information to know that this is not my invoice. I'm just going to go ahead and reject it. And when you reject, you can reject back to previous approvers. So rejecting doesn't mean that I have to necessarily just reject it and send it all the way back to where it originated. I can reject back to someone who may have been a previous approver. Now, the difference between syncing the task and approving is that approving means that this invoice has been coded to the point where when I click the approval button, it's then going to take that invoice and it's going to update Intacct, and I could potentially go into Intacct and my financials in Intacct have been updated, and I can then look for that particular information in Intacct, and I can also look at the image. What syncing the task means is that I still have some work to do. So when I click on sync the task, it opens up the invoice, and again, I have some things that I need to do here. So obviously this invoice hasn't been fully coded at all. There's still a lot of things that need to take place. So I've got to go through and I've got to finish that coding in order to get this invoice off to either another approver or updating Sage Intacct if I'm the final approver in this particular process. So it's designed in kind of the same way the entry screen is. And again, if we were to just go in here and I change this and we go to form view, I'm not going to really try and shrink my screen down too dramatically, but what I could do is this can be set up in such a way where I could be sitting on a phone, for example, and I can have the system designed so that I'm looking at the image on one side and the data entry on the other, where I can basically see everything, and I can code from my phone, from an iPad, whatever device I'm working from. Again, from here, I can look at my various line items. If I need to go in here and start coding, I can put in my information. All of my search criteria works the same way, where I'm searching Intacct. I can go in and put in my dollar amount, whatever else I need to code, but all of the information here is available to me for searching if I need to. I have the option here to be able to put the invoice on hold. So obviously different from the situation back here when I was in data entry. As an approver, I can put invoices on hold. I can save what I've done so far. So if I want to come back to this later on, again, I can just go through, process what I need to, save it, and then come back later. You can email from here. So if, for example, I needed to correspond with someone at Sun Cleaning, and I wanted to be able to send them, an email, and I wanted to also attach a copy of the invoice, I just click on the email button. I can attach the invoice, and I can send it off right from here. The workflows allow me to see who's part of the workflow process. Who are we sending this invoice off to? And who else, maybe has already seen this invoice before it got to me. And again, I could add notes, and I can view any notes associated with this invoice. And if there were any supporting documents that I wanted to look at or attach, that I potentially wanted to attach on the approval side, I could do so. Ultimately, I'm either going to reject or approve this invoice. And approving means I finished my coding, and now this invoice is going on to either another approver, because maybe there's someone else in the approval chain, or that invoice has been completed, and it's now sending the invoice over to Intacct. Now, just a note here, I can't send this invoice and update Intacct unless it has been fully coded. So there's some protection mechanism here that eliminates the, someone from being able to just go ahead and approve an invoice and updating Intacct with only partially coded information. So it's going to force me through the approval process and through the workflow here to update Intacct with a fully coded invoice. Let's say we've done that. So let's say we've approved invoices and they've gone off to Intacct. So let's come in here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a particular record that I've selected. Whoops, I may have gotten disconnected because I've been out of there for a while. So let's go back in.
And we did have a question come through, Mike, if you have a second for that as well.
Sure thing, absolutely.
Yeah, there was a question. Is it possible to route approvals only to entities that are in a multi-entity environment? So if there's 5 entities and 3 of them are on an invoice, is it possible that only 3 of those get hit with the other one?
Yes. Yeah, you can set up the workflows designed to send to just certain entities and not others. Yes, absolutely.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right, so here in Intacct, let's say that I've processed an invoice and I want to go look at it. So I'm just going to call up this particular record here. And what we've done in Titanium is we've created this Titanium attachments tool. So in here, if I just go ahead and I select this, I can then just open up that particular invoice. So I've now taken that invoice image after it's been processed and it's been and it has updated Intacct, and I've been able to attach that invoice automatically. So there's nothing that I had to do, anything special that I had to do in order to make this work. It's just part of the application out of the box. So if we go back over here, I'm going to show another attachment here in a couple of moments. Well, let's go back. So we've gone through the approval process and we've approved invoices. So now let's say that in Intacct, we've now gone through the point where we have processed checks. So what TimberScan Titanium allows us is we have what's called an attached check feature. How this works is, again, it starts at the point where we're going to go through and we're going to acquire a batch of checks. So if you printed these out on check stock, or if you had used some sort of an automated tool, maybe you printed them to a file, we're just going to go out, we're going to select them from the file, and in this case, these are going to be checks, not invoices. So a little correction here, we just make them checks. But again, we would select those checks from the file, queue them up, and where they would reside would be in this attached checks feature here. So now here, what I can do is I could take that batch of checks. So I've already done this. So I've gone in, I've grabbed a batch of checks, and what I can do is I can specify what the bank account number is and what the starting check number is. So I could have potentially, I could have 50 checks queued up here, one right behind the other. I'm starting with this check number here and then everything behind it. So when I hit the attach button, what it will do is it will ripple through each of these particular checks and it will attach it to the invoice image that it's associated with. You notice in this case that this check paid two separate invoices. So that same check image is going to be attached to both invoices. And again, what that does is that allows me over here to come back in here. And again, if I open this up, so now I have not only the invoice, but I also have the check as well. So we build this packet of information and it's associated in Intacct, allowing me to see the invoice, any of the supporting documents, and the check all together combined. And then if I needed to, I can use my tools from within Intacct. So if I needed to go email, a copy of this invoice or check or what have you to someone, I can do that. Or print it out or whatever I want to do. We don't want to print because we don't want to use any paper, obviously. Okay, so back over here, we'll just finish up here with a couple of other things. I know that obviously the workflow process is kind of a key component here. And what we've done is we've set this up in such a way that there's kind of a hierarchy to this. It starts with the routing fields, and I won't get into a lot of detail unless we kind of need to at some point, but it starts with the routing fields. And what the routing fields are, they're the triggers. What fields or a combination of fields are going to trigger the workflow? And there's a hierarchy to this. So in this case, what I've said is that I want my trigger to be vendor and then entity ID. That's going to be my top level. If it doesn't find that, it's going to look for location ID, and if it doesn't find that, then it's going to look just specifically for the entity itself. So you can see that the first thing we do, we set up these triggers that allow us to determine how we're going to go about the process of determining the invoice routing. The routing values group, what this does is this allows me to take those particular values and specify, for example, who we're sending them to. So I talked about vendor being kind of the top level with the routing fields. So now I'm saying, okay, what vendors do we want associated with this? So in this case, what it's saying is if we have a vendor 39 or vendor 36 and the entity 10, that's what it's going to use to trigger that particular routing. From there, we go to workflows. Workflows are basically just how we're going to go about routing the invoices. So is it going to be, an AP invoice? Or is it going to be any other type of document? And then finally, we go to what are called the routing rules. And what the routing rules do is this is where we tie the workflows and the values together and identify which rules apply to specific document types. So in here, I can then say, say for an AP bill, this is the routing value that we want to use, and it's associated with these vendors. So I don't want to get into too much of the complexity there. It is a little bit of a maze when you start to set this up. And then we kind of proceed forward from there. But it does have provide a tremendous amount of flexibility to allow for routing at various levels, including thresholds, for example. Okay, one last thing. We also have, I mentioned that we have the search utility here. So the way that the search screen works is that I could basically go out and I can select or choose and search for anything that I want. I could be specific in terms of document type, indexes, categories, whatever I want, or I can just do a conditional search. So if, for example, I wanted to do or create what's called a substantiated billing, where I need to be able to compile all the backup for that substantiated bill for a T&M or cost plus billing, I can go out here and I can say, okay, give me everything for project number, whatever it might be. In this case, I'm just going to use vendor just for sake of argument here. But, you know, I could say, give me everything for a particular project, if I can find vendor. And then once I've done that, I just select that particular project. I can put in a date range. And what the system will do is it will compile all of the invoice images and any supporting documents associated with that search. And then I'm able to go through and take those particular invoices and use them as backup for a substantiated billing. And with that, I'm going to stop at this point and I guess open it up for any questions.